Good evening, everyone. In the previous session, we discussed about Spring annotations. Annotations introduced in the Java 1.5 version. Annotations are alternate for XML configurations. In Spring Framework, we have several annotations like configuration annotation, component scan annotation, component annotation, service, repository, scope, auto-wide, qualifier, primary, bean. Like that, we have several annotations. As we have discussed in the last example, configuration annotation will represent Java class as configuration class. Component scan, it is used to identify bean classes available in the project based on the base package names. Okay, so here, if you have multiple packages based on the base package name, it is going to scan the classes and will identify which class is represented as a Spring Bean. And we have component annotation. Component annotation is used to represent Java class as Spring Bean. Okay. Next one is service annotation. It is used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. Component will represent our Java class as Spring Bean. Service class also will represent the Java class as a Spring Bean. And repository annotation, it is used to represent Java class as a Spring Bean. So normal generic Java classes will be used in component. And if your class having some business logic, then we will write @service layer to represent that Java class as Spring Bean. @repository, if your Java class is having some persistence logic, to represent that class as a Spring Bean, we will use repository annotation. To represent scope of the bean, we will use @scope annotation. And if you want to represent dependency injection, then we can go for auto-wide annotation. And if you want to identify the dependent bean based on the bean name, then we will go for @qualifier annotation. And here we have @primary to represent the primary bean for auto wiring. When we have more than one bean satisfying for dependency injection, then we will go for @primary. Then what is @bean annotation? I don't want IOC container to create the object for my bean. I want to create the object for my bean. Then we will go for @bean annotation. It is used to call the method which returns the bean object. @bean to call the method which returns the bean object. So these are the annotations that we have seen in the previous class, and we have done example on those annotations also. Perfect. Good. Now, today we are going to start with Spring Boot. So today we are having our first session on the Spring Boot. So what is Spring Boot? What are the advantages of the Spring Boot? Why we need to go for Spring Boot? All these details we are going to discuss today. Okay, guys. So before going to start the Spring Boot, we had some introduction related to Spring Framework and some fundamental concepts of the Spring Framework. So from today, we are going to understand what is the Spring Boot and why we need to go for Spring Boot. Perfect. First of all, what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications. Already, we can develop our projects by using Spring Framework, right? We can develop standalone application by using Spring. We can develop web application also by using Spring. Whatever the applications that we can develop by using Spring Framework, whatever the applications that we can develop by using Spring Framework, same type of applications can be developed by using Spring Boot also. Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Okay, we have seen in the Spring, we need to write a lot of configuration. We need to do XML configurations in the Spring Framework. So Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Now, this is Spring Boot having several advantages when compared with the Spring Framework. So you can say that Spring Boot is equal to Spring Framework minus XML configurations. Minus XML configurations. Whatever the XML configurations are available in the Spring Framework, if we remove those XML configurations from the Spring Framework, then it is called as a Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is developed on top of the Spring Framework. Spring Boot is not replacement for Spring. Spring Boot is not replacement for Spring Framework. Spring Boot is not replacement for Spring Framework. Boot developed on top of Spring Framework. So whatever the concepts that are available in the Spring Framework, all those concepts can be used in the Spring Boot also. Spring Boot is not replacement for Spring Framework. Boot developed on top of Spring Framework. So what is the Spring Boot? Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configuration. If we remove XML configurations from the Spring Framework, then we can call it as Spring Boot. Boot is not replacement for Spring Framework. Boot developed on top of Spring Framework. So all the concepts of the Spring can be used in the Spring Boot also. All Spring Framework concepts can be used in Spring Boot also. Okay, now we have two options to develop application by using Spring. You can develop the application by using Spring, plain Spring Core, right? So by using Spring Core, by using the old Spring Framework also, we can develop one application, and by using Boot also, we can develop one application. When we develop the application by using Boot, so you no need to take care of the configurations. So everything is already auto configured in the Spring Boot. So what are the advantages with the Spring Boot? So the Spring Boot definition is very simple. It is just one approach to develop Spring-based applications with minimal configurations. Then come to advantages of the Spring Boot. So what are the advantages available in the Spring Boot? The first advantage with the Spring Boot is less configurations. Okay, whatever the configuration is required for the project, that configuration will be taken care by Spring Boot only. In the Spring, programmer is responsible to do the configurations, whereas in the Spring Boot, programmer is not responsible for doing the configuration. And the second advantage in the Spring Boot is POM starters. Okay, so it provided several starters to develop the project. Now, for example, I want to develop a web application. All the configurations that are required for web application development will be provided by Web Starter. Okay, example, there are several starters available. Web Starter is available. JPA Starter is available. JPA Starter available in the Spring Boot. Security Starter is available in the Spring Boot. Mail Starter is available in the Spring Boot. Like, so if you want any dependency, ready-made starters are providing by Spring Boot. So by using these starters, we can minimize our configuration in the pom.xml or in the Gradle build configuration. You no need to add so many dependencies in the pom.xml when we are using Spring Boot because it provided ready-made starters. For example, Web Starter. So if you add Web Starter dependency, it will download all the related jars which are required to download to develop a web application by using Spring Boot. So POM starters is one of the biggest advantage of going for Spring Boot. So what are the main advantages of the Spring Boot? The first advantage is less configuration. And the second advantage is POM starters. Less configuration means configuration will be taken care by Spring Boot. POM starters means you no need to add so many dependencies in the pom.xml. You no need to add so many dependencies in the pom.xml. If you want to develop a web application, you just add the Web Starter. It will take care of all the dependencies. If you want to communicate with the database, then you just add the JPA Starter. It will take care of all the data source connection pool configurations and everything. Security Starter. If you want to implement a security for your project, you just add the Security Starter, then Boot will take care of security for your project. If you want to send email by using Spring Boot, then you just add the Mail Starter. So ready-made starters provided by Spring Boot to simplify our dependencies configuration. It can be a Maven configuration or it can be a Gradle configuration. We can add POM starters given by Spring Boot. That is the second advantage. And the third advantage with the Spring Boot is auto configuration. The third advantage with the Spring Boot is auto configuration. Sir, what is auto configuration? Whatever the configuration is required for our application, that will be taken care by Spring Boot. So as of now, what we are doing, we are creating one configuration class. We are giving that configuration class as an input for IOC container, and we are starting that IOC container. When we go for Spring Boot, all that stuff is not required. You no need to create the configuration class. You no need to specify component scanning. You no need to start IOC container. So whatever the configuration is required for your project, that will be taken care by Spring Boot only. That is called as auto configuration. Less configuration is one advantage. Form starters is the second advantage. Auto configuration is the third advantage. So what is the meaning of auto configuration? Any configuration that is required for the boot application, that will be taken care by Spring Boot only. So it is providing the configurations which are required. If you see in the Spring application, we are writing one class as a configuration class. We are representing that class as a configuration class, and we are specifying the component scan, and we are starting the IOC container manually. Programmatically, we are starting the IOC container, and we are giving configuration class as the input for IOC, and we are asking get bean, give the bean object. So creating the configuration class or starting the IOC container, it is a common for every project, not only for one project. Any Spring application will need to deal with the configurations, need to deal with the IOC container. So whatever the common configurations which are required for every project is already automated in the Spring Boot, that is called auto configuration. Okay, and the fourth advantage in the Spring Boot is embedded servers. So what is the meaning of embedded servers? For every web application, we need one server to execute. When we develop a web application, that web application will be packaged as a WAR file. In order to run that WAR file, we need to download and we need to set up the server. Yesterday, I have uploaded one video, how to set up a Tomcat server. We need to download the Tomcat server. We need to install the Tomcat. We need to deploy our WAR file to the Tomcat server. So for web application, it is common. But when you go for Spring Boot, you no need to think about the servers, because whenever you add, whenever we add a web starter, automatically one server will be available for our project. So here we have a web starter. Whenever we add a web starter, automatically server will be available for our project. You no need to set up the server, and you no need to deploy your project into the server when we go for Spring Boot, because embedded servers concept is available. You just add a web starter, automatically Spring Boot will provide you Tomcat as a default embedded server. Example, Tomcat, it will provide you as a default server. You can go for Jetty server, you can go for Netty server, and you can deploy Spring Boot application in the third-party server also. Boot will provide you one server. If you are not satisfied with that, then you can deploy the project into the third-party server which you want. But whenever you want to develop a web application, Boot is intelligent. Boot will understand. For web application deployment, server is required. Boot will provide that server for you. You no need to set up that. That is also one of the auto configuration concept available in the Spring Boot. And the other advantage with the Spring Boot is actuators. Actuators, they will provide production ready features for our application. Actuators will provide production ready features for our application. So what is the meaning of production ready features of the application? When my application is running in the server, what is the health of the application, and how many beans loaded into memory, JVM's memory, how many threads are currently running, what is the heap capacity, how much memory available in the heap, how much memory utilized in the heap. All that information can be accessed from our application by using actuators. So Spring Boot provided actuators concept. They are used to get production ready features of the application. Embedded servers are available. They are used to run our Boot application in the server directly. You no need to deploy Boot application to a server manually. If you just create the application, then you will get the server. When you run the application, it will deploy in the server also. That means by using Spring Boot, you can create the applications we can just run. The applications that you can just run. If you create the project, that production ready features will be available for the application. We can just run the Spring Boot application by using embedded servers. Auto configuration. What are the common configurations like server setup, deploying in the server, connection pool configuration, IOC container starting, right? All these things will be automated in the Spring Boot because of auto configuration facility. Form starters are available. Form starters are going to simplify our dependencies in the pom.xml. You don't need to add multiple dependencies to develop a project. You just add one web starter, then Boot will download the remaining dependencies which are required for the web application development by using Boot. And less configuration. So you don't need to write XML files to configure your beans. You don't need to write configuration classes to represent your beans. You don't need to write component scanning. You don't need to start IOC container. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. These are some powerful features of the Spring Boot. Okay, guys, let us see. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. When we are going for Spring Boot, you can simply create the project which we can just run. No need of doing any additional settings for the boot. So what is Spring Boot? Spring Framework minus XML configurations is called as a Spring Boot. So we can develop our applications in two ways. By using Spring Framework, we can develop our application. By using Spring Boot also, we can develop our application. If you develop the project by using Spring, you need to take care of configurations on your own. Programmers are responsible to take the configurations in the Spring Framework, whereas in the Spring Boot, auto configuration concept is available. Sir, there are so many advantages in the Spring Boot which are not available in the Spring. So then, can I say that Boot is replacement for the Spring? No, Spring Boot is not replacement for Spring Framework. Boot developed on top of the Spring Framework. Spring Boot is not replacement for the Spring Framework. Boot developed on top of Spring Framework. All Spring Framework concepts also can be used in the Spring Boot. So what are the main reasons that we are going for Spring Boot? Why Spring Boot is most famous in the market? Because of its advantages. What are the problems are available in the Spring? Those problems are rectified in the Spring Boot. The first advantage with the Spring Boot, it is less configuration based. You no need to do lot of configurations in the Spring Boot to develop the applications. Okay, configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot, and everything is completely annotation based. Spring Boot will not support for any XML, guys. In the Spring, we can use XML configurations, but in the Spring Boot, XML configurations will not be available. Everything is annotation based only, and that too, you no need to write lot of configuration. Boot will take care of that. And the second advantage is form starters in the Spring Boot. So here, for every application, we will have some dependencies. Like I want a Hibernate in my project, or I want web development. I want security for my project. I want to send emails in my project. For every requirement, Boot is providing some starters. Those are called as form starters. We can call it as dependencies. In the Maven will have pom.xml to configure the dependencies. Gradle will have build.gradle file to configure the dependencies. You no need to configure many dependencies because form starters are ready-made available. If you want to develop a web application, web starter is available. If you want to develop an application with database communication, JPA starter is available. If you want to implement security for your boot application, security starter is available. And if you want to develop email functionality, email starter is available. Email starter is available. Okay. And auto configuration. What are the common configurations that are required for the application that will be taken care by Spring Boot? For example, performing the component scanning, identify the classes which are available in the project, identify the Spring Beans which are available in the project, identifying the Spring Beans which are available in the project. Okay. And creating the connection pool, deploying the application to the server. All these things are auto-configured in the Spring Boot. And next one is embedded servers. For every web application deployment, we need a server. Like Tomcat server, we will set up the server. We will deploy application war file to Tomcat. For Spring Boot applications, you no need to do that, because if you create a project with WebStarter, Spring Boot is intelligent. It will understand that we need a server to run this project. Boot will provide that server also. So Tomcat, Jetty, Netty, these are the servers which is providing by Spring Boot as embedded. The default server is Tomcat. If you don't want that, you can use Jetty as a default, or if you want, you can deploy boot application into third-party server also. And boot is providing actuators. What is the meaning of actuators? Actuator nothing but they are going to help us to monitor and manage our application. I want to understand metrics of my application. How many classes loaded by my project? How many endpoints are available in my project? URL patterns available in my project? What is the thread dump of my project? What is heap dump of my project? All such kind of information we can access from the project by using Spring Boot actuators. So are you guys clear with the definition of what is the Spring Boot and what are the advantages of the Spring Boot? Guys, come on. Are you clear with definition of the Spring Boot and are you clear with advantages of the Spring Boot? Yes, perfect. Now here, current version of the Spring Boot is Spring Boot 3.x. Spring Boot came into market in the year of 2014, guys. The current version of the Spring Boot is Spring Boot 3.x. Now, Spring Boot version history. For every 2 weeks, for every 3 weeks, a new version is coming into the market. Okay, so here the current version of the Spring Boot is 3.x version, and very recently this is Spring Boot 3.x version came into market. Spring Boot makes it easy to create standalone production grade Spring based applications that you can just run. Okay, so Spring Boot is making our life easy to make applications. It can be a standalone application or it can be a production grade application that you can just run. That means the remaining stuff, the configuration will be taken care by Spring Boot only. Spring Boot makes it easy to create standalone production grade Spring based applications that you can just run. Configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot only. Now, when this Spring Boot came into market, okay, so in which year Spring Boot came into market? You can see that Spring Boot Wiki. So if you go to Spring Boot, Spring Framework, the version histories also we can see. The recent version of the Spring is 6.0, which released 3 months back. Spring 6.0 came into market in the last year, November, and Spring Boot is taken care all the advantages, right? Spring Boot version history. We can check the version history of Spring Boot. Spring Boot version history. Where is that? Spring Boot version history. Yep. Now you can see that there are several versions available for Spring Boot. Now, the recent version of the Spring Boot is 3.x. So 2.5 and this is old one, version 2.x is there, and version 3.x also came into market. So version 3.x also came into market. That was very recent version. And when the first version of the Spring Boot came into picture, the first version of the Spring Boot 1.x, and before that we have Spring 1.0, something like that. So those versions are came into market, right? Now you can see in the MVN repository. So the first version of the Spring Boot came into market in the year of 2014. In 2014, the first version of the Spring Boot came into market, and now the latest version of the Spring Boot is 3.0.2, which released in the year of 2023 Jan 20. So just right, very recent Spring Boot 3.x came into market. In the November, they have started the Spring Boot 3.0. November 24, 2022, Spring Boot 3.x version came into market. 3.0.1 came in the December and 3.0.2 came in the January. So within 3 months, 3 versions they have released. So the major version 3.x that got released in the November 2022. The first version of the Spring Boot that released in the year of 2014. This is the first 1.0.0 release, Spring Boot first version that released in the year of 2014. The current version of the Spring Boot is 3.0, which released in the year of November 2022. Spring Boot 1.0 released in 2014. Current version of the Spring Boot is 3.0.1. X version. So it released in the November 2022. It released in the year of November 2022. Guys, now note, to use Spring Boot 3.x version, Java 17 is mandatory. If you want to use Spring Boot 3.x version, then you need to have Java 17. That is the minimum requirement. So if you are using 2.x version, Java 8 is fine. But if you want to use the latest version of the Spring Boot, Java 17 is mandatory. Java 17 is mandatory. Java 17 is mandatory to work with Spring Boot 3.x. Java 17 is mandatory to work with Spring Boot 3.x version. But so when you attend the interview, can you say you are working on Spring Boot 3.x? When you attend the interview, 3 years experience, can you say you are using Spring Boot 3.x version? No. Why? Because it came very recently into the market. It came very recently into the market. So in the industry also, no project is using Spring Boot 3. The reason is it is very recent version and we don't know what are the issues available in the Boot 3.x version. So whenever new version comes into the market, immediately companies will not use that version to develop the project because there may be some bug in the new version. There may be some issue in the new version. So that's why people will wait for few months to understand the complete functionality of the new version, and then only they will start using that new version. Okay. Still in the market, people are using Spring Boot 2.x version. Even in my current project also, we are using Spring Boot 2.x version only. We have not upgraded to Spring Boot 3.x because it is very recent version in the market. And remember, whenever a new version comes, immediately IT companies will not use that version. Okay? Whenever new version of software released, like Java 17, Java 18, Java 19, whenever new version comes, immediately people are not going to use it to develop the project. People will wait a couple of months to understand the behavior of the new version, to understand the issues with the new version. Once the people believe that it is stable, everything is working perfect in that version, then only people will prefer that version to develop the project. So do you think that people are using Java 17 to develop the projects in the market? Do you think that people are using Java 17 to develop the projects in the market? So which version of Java is most famous to develop the projects? Java 8 and Java 11. Most of the companies are using Java 8. 70 to 80% of companies are using Java 8. 25 to 30% of the people are using Java 11. So now, whatever the Spring Boot 3 that came into market, it may take another 5 to 6 months of time for the people to understand the issues with that, and then only people will use that version. Okay, people will not use the version immediately now. But so to have the idea, the first version of the Spring Boot released in the year of 2014. Current version of the Spring Boot is 3.x, which released in the year of November 2022. Released in the year of November 2022. Note, Java 17 is mandatory to work with the Spring Boot 3.x version. Okay, fine guys. So theoretically, we understood what is the Spring Boot. Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications with less configurations. Boot is not replacement for Spring. Boot developed on top of the Spring framework. All Spring framework concepts can be used in the Boot also. What are the advantages with the Spring Boot? Less configuration. That means you no need to write XML files and you no need to use many annotations also. It will be taken care of all the configurations. So XML configurations are completely avoided. We can say that less configuration and no XMLs. No XML configurations. You no need to do any XML file creation in the Spring Boot. Form starters. Dependencies provided by Spring Boot to develop the application. That means jars. What are the jars you want? You specify the starter. Then it will give you that dependency. Auto configuration. Some common logics like creating IOC container, scanning the components to identify which class is Spring Bean, deploying the application to server. All these configurations will be taken care by Spring Boot. That is called auto configuration. and what is embedded server. So Spring Boot will provide you ready-made servers to run your application. You no need to set up the server on your own. You just create web application. It will give you server also to run your project. Actuators. Actuators are helping us to understand production ready features of our application. Production ready features nothing but understanding the metrics of the application, getting the statistics of the application. So the official definition from the Spring Boot team. Spring Boot makes it easy to create standalone, production grade, Spring based applications that you can just run. So whatever the project you create by using Spring Boot, you can just run that project. Configurations will be taken care by Boot itself. The first version of the Spring Boot came into market in the year of 2014. The current version of the Spring Boot is 3.x version, which released in the year of 2022. So Java 17 is mandatory to work with the Boot 3.x version. All right, perfect. Now the thing is how to create Boot application. Now we discussed a lot of things. What is Boot? What are the advantages of the Boot? And what is the current version of the Boot? Now, how to create Spring Boot application? Spring Boot application creation. Spring Boot application creation. Spring Boot application we can create in two ways, guys. We can create the Boot application in two ways. We can create Boot application in two ways. What are the two ways to create the Boot application? First one is by using Initializr website. They provided one website to develop our Boot application, that is start.spring.io. By using Initializr website, you can create Boot application, and the second one is Spring Starter project in IDE. If you want to develop the Boot application, then we have two options. Okay, one is by using official website, that is start.spring.io, which is also called as Initializr website. From this website, we can create the project and we will download that project as a zip file. Then we need to import that project into IDE. And instead of creating as a zip and importing into IDE, directly we can create the project in the IDE also. So in how many ways we can create the Boot application? We can create the Spring Boot application in two ways. One is by using Initializr website, and the second one is by using Starter project. Are you clear with that? Are you clear with that? Yes, let me go to the Initializr website to download that. We can create the project and we can download the project as a zip file. Then we need to import that zip file into IDE. That is one process. The second process, directly you can create the project in the IDE itself. Very good. So let me go for that start.spring.io. That is Spring Initializr website. Spring Initializr website. Now, I want to create a Spring Boot application. From this URL, you can create the project and you can download that project as a zip file. Start.spring.io. Okay. So here when we are trying to create the project now here I'm trying to create the project by using Initializr website. You see here. Now, if you use project creation here, it is asking, do you want to use Gradle with Groovy as a build tool? Do you want to use Gradle with Kotlin as a build tool? Do you want to use Maven as a build tool? Okay, so Spring Boot will support for both types of build tools. Spring Boot project can be created by using Maven as a build tool. Spring Boot project can be created by using Gradle as a build tool. So Gradle will support for Groovy DSL as well as Kotlin DSL. Okay, now you can use anything. I'm using Maven. Then Spring Boot project, do you want to create by using Java? Do you want to create by using Kotlin? Do you want to create by using Groovy? This Kotlin and Groovy also JVM based languages. So you can develop a Spring Boot application by using Kotlin language. You can develop by using Groovy language. You can develop by using Java language. We don't know that Kotlin and Groovy, so we are going with Java language. And here if you observe, Two settings I have selected. One is build tool, Maven build tool I have selected. If you want, you can use a Gradle build tool also. Anything is fine. So some projects I will develop with Maven. Some projects I will develop with Gradle as well. We know Gradle tool also. Maven and language, I'm selecting as a Java. Which version of the Spring Boot you want to use? So the stable version of the Spring Boot 3.0.2. And if you want to go with the 2.x version, 2.7.8 is the last version in the 2.x version. So 2.7.8 is the last version. And if you want to go with the Boot 3, then you can go for 3.0.2. Perfect. Project metadata. So here, what is the group ID you want to give for your project? Group ID generally we will give as our company name. For which company we are developing the project, that company name we will give as a group ID. Artifact ID represents name of the project. What is our project name? So let me give my project name as 01 Spring Boot application. I'm giving my project name as 01 Spring Boot application. The name of the project, description of the project, and the name of the package. What is the package name you want? Base package name. I want to keep my project base package name as in.ashokite. Are you clear? Project type I'm selecting as Maven. Language I'm selecting as Java. Boot version I'm selecting as 2.7.8. Group ID I'm giving as in.ashokite. You can give anything as a group ID. Generally, people will prefer company name as a group ID. And artifact ID also you can give anything. People will prefer project name as artifact ID. And package name, I'm giving the package name as in.ashokite. And packaging type I'm giving as jar. So I want to create this as a standalone application. If you want to create a web application, you can select the packaging type as a var. Packaging type I'm selecting as a jar. Boot is supporting Java 8 is the minimum for 2.x version. Java 8, Java 11, Java 17, Java 19. So I have Java 8 in my system. I'm selecting Java 8. The next week I will install Java 17 in my system. Then we will go with the Java 17 also. Currently I'm going with Java version 8. Now here we have options. Click on generate, click on explore, click on share. When I click on share, I will get this copy. I copy that. People can use that URL to download the project. When I click on explore, it will show me the project structure which it is going to create, the pom.xml file, and in the SRC, the Java class and properties file, the test class, what it is creating. The basic project folder structure, it is going to display for me when I click on this explore option. When you click on generate option, it will download the zip file. Spring Boot application, which is created based on the given settings, and the boot application is downloaded. When I click on generate. Fine. Here we have one more option called dependencies. So what dependencies you want? If you want to develop a web application, then you can add the dependencies. DevTools, Lombok, web dependency, reactive, GraphQL, session dependency, Jersey, time-lived dependency, Spring security, OAuth dependencies, JDBC dependencies. So what dependencies you want to add in your project? Those dependencies can be selected from here and you can click on generate. So now if you see in the downloads folder, Spring Boot application is downloaded as a zip file. We can extract that zip file. Spring Boot app is created. Inside the Spring Boot app, you can see SRC and pom.xml. Inside the SRC, main Java, test Java will be available. So like this, our Spring Boot application got created. Whatever the boot application is created, we can select that application. We can import that application into our IDE. I just created the project and I downloaded. I got the zip file. I have extracted that zip file. Now I will go inside this. You see pom.xml. Select this location up to pom.xml, file, import. So I created this project by using Maven. Just to select import Maven project. Observe, project is created from initializer website, Spring Initializer, start.spring.io. I have generated that project. It is downloaded as a zip. I extracted that zip. Now I am going into my IDE, file, import, Maven. So Spring Boot project I created by using Maven. So I will select as existing Maven project. If you use Gradle then you will import as existing Gradle project. I created by using Maven, so I'm selecting existing Maven project. Click on next, project root directory. You need to give the location up to the pom.xml file. Where the pom.xml is available, give the location up to that pom.xml. I have given. Click on finish. Now you can see my first Spring Boot application got imported. You can see my first Spring Boot application got imported into IDE. Let me close unrelated projects. 01 Spring Boot application imported. Main Java, main resources, test Java, Maven dependencies. Already it downloaded all the dependencies. Okay. Maven dependencies are available. Pom.xml. Spring Boot configuration is available in the Maven pom.xml. Already it is giving Spring Boot parent dependency, Spring Boot starter dependency. We discussed about POM starters, right? So those POM starters are available in the pom.xml. Whatever the starter you want, you can add that starter here. Like this, we are able to create the project by using initializer website, and we are able to import that project into IDE. Can you guys do that quickly? I gave the link. I gave the link for you. Can you create the project? And can you import the project into IDE? And can you tell me, are you able to do that? Come on, guys, do it quickly. Do it quickly. Shiv Sai, what is a snapshot? What is release? I will explain. Snapshot means the project is under development. Release means project development is completed. Here, our project version is coming as snapshot. Snapshot means our project is under development. It is not completed. Release means the project is completed. Okay, guys. Yeah. So the error symbol, it is unknown error, guys. You can just delete it. That's not a problem. Okay. That is unknown error. You can delete it. No issue. Are you guys able to create the project? Let me know. Are you able to create the project? Come on. Are you able to import that project? Yeah. Once your project is created, you can just right click, run as boot application. You can right click and run as boot application. It will start that Spring Boot project. You can see on the console, a Spring Boot logo will be printed. So if you are getting that message, that means our application started successfully. After importing the project into our IDE, we need to right click on the project, run as boot application. When you run it as a boot application, application will start and you can see this message on the console. If you are able to see this message on the console, that means your Spring Boot project is created successfully. All of you do it and confirm. All of you do it and confirm. Are you able to create that boot project? Yeah. So same thing we can do from IDE also, guys. I'm going to show you now how to create the boot project by using IDE also. We are able to create by using starter. So every time creating the project in the starter, downloading the zip file, importing that project into IDE, that is a headache. That is headache. So as a developer, we will use IDE to develop our projects. So can we create boot application from IDE directly? Yes, we can do that. Now observe here, file, new, there will be an option called Spring Starter project. Spring's legacy project, nothing but Spring Framework project. Spring Starter project, nothing but Spring Boot project. Spring Legacy project means it is old Spring application. Spring Starter project means it is boot application. When you are creating Spring Boot application from IDE, go to File, New, you need to select the Spring Starter project. You need to select the Spring Starter project. Now guys, understand the comedy here. Whenever we use Spring Starter project in the IDE, internally our IDE also communicating with the initializer website. When we are trying to create the starter project, that from IDE internally communicating with the initializer website. So here my IDE communicating with the initializer website. That means internet connection is mandatory for your system to create the boot application. Remember that. Without having the net connection, you cannot create the boot application. Why? Because when you are using IDE also, internally IDE communicating with the initializer website only to create the boot project. Now I am giving the name as 02 Spring Boot app. 02 Spring Boot app. Build tool, you can use Gradle or you can use Maven. Already I used Maven for the initializer. Here I can use Gradle. Packaging type jar, Java version 8. Language type Java. Whatever the options we are selecting in the initializer website, same options we can select in our IDE also. You can use Gradle or Maven, anything is fine. So 02 Spring Boot app, packaging type is jar, language is Java, group ID, company name. I'm giving in.ashok IT as a group ID. Artifact ID is 02. Here, snapshot is there. You can change the version also. You can keep the version also 1.0, no problem. But generally, as we are in the development mode of the project, we will keep it as a snapshot. Snapshot represents the project is under development. Snapshot represent project is under development. Package. Here, what is the base package you want in the project? I'm keeping the base package name as in.ashok IT. I want to keep the base package name as in.ashok IT. Then click on next. So once you click on next, dependencies. What dependency you want to add, which version of the Spring Boot you want to use, you can select the boot version. 3.0.2 is the latest. 0.3 snapshot, it is under development. Okay, snapshot versions we should not use in the project because still their development is not completed. 2.7.8 is the final in the 2.x version. Click on next, click on finish. So when I click on finish, you can observe a boot application is getting created in the IDE directly. So when I create the project from IDE, internally IDE will talk to initializer website only to create the project. So remember, internet connection is mandatory for your system because our IDE should communicate with the initializer website. Without net connection, it will not create the project. Internet connection is mandatory to create the project. Internet connection is mandatory to create the project. Yeah. Now you see my project is created successfully by using Gradle. Spring Boot app, SRC main Java, main resources, test Java, build.gradle file, and settings.gradle file. So now right click on this project, run as boot application. So when we run the boot application, you can see here also same. Spring logo is printing and we are able to see this message on the console. By using Maven, we are able to create the boot application. By using Gradle, we are able to create the boot application. And we are able to create the project from Initializr website. And we are able to create the project by using IDE also. Are you guys comfortable with boot application creation? Are you guys clear with boot application creation? In how many ways we can create the boot application, guys? In how many ways we can create the boot application? We can create the boot application in 2 ways. One is by using Initializr website. Second one is by using IDE. When we create boot application using IDE, internally it will communicate with the Initializr website only. If we try to create boot application, using IDE, then internally IDE will communicate with the Initializr website only. Initializr website to create the project. So here you need to remember, internet connection is mandatory for our system. Mandatory for our system to create Spring Boot application. If you don't have internet connection for your system, then your IDE cannot communicate with the Initializr website. Your project creation will fail. Internet connection is mandatory for the system to create the boot application. Okay. When we are creating the boot application, we have to choose the below details. First one is build tool. We can use a build tool as Maven or Gradle. We can use anything. It will support for Maven as a build tool. It will support for Gradle. It will support Maven build tool. It will support Gradle build tool. Then language. Language, it will support Java. It will support Groovy. It will support Kotlin. That means not only for Java, Spring Boot can be used for Groovy projects also. Spring Boot can be used for Kotlin projects also. Groovy and Kotlin are also JVM based languages. So we can create boot project with Groovy. We can create boot application with Kotlin. Language we can select as Java or Groovy or Kotlin. Build tool we can select as Maven or Gradle. Group ID. So generally group ID, it represents company name. It represents company name or project name. It represents company name or project name. Example, you can give group ID as in.ashok IT if we are developing the project for Ashok IT. Or if you are developing project for IBM, you can give that as com.ibm. Some IRCTC project that can be given as a group ID. You can give anything as a group ID. Generally, group ID represents our company names. And the next one, artifact ID. So when we are creating the project artifact ID, it represents project name or module name. It represents project name or module name. You can give anything. Generally, people will give group ID as a company name, artifact ID as the project name. And version. So basically, version initially it will be representing as snapshot. Snapshot. What is the meaning of snapshot? Guys, versions are divided into 2 types. Snapshot version means project under development. Project development is not finished. Release or final. Project development completed. Project development completed. So if you use snapshot as the version, that means the project is under development. So if you use release, that means the project development is completed. So when we are creating the boot application, it will ask which build tool you want to use. We can use Maven as a build tool. We can use Gradle also as a build tool. And which language you want to use to create the project. You can use a Java language or Groovy language or Kotlin language. And it will ask for what is the group ID. It represents company name and project name as a group ID. And it will ask what is the artifact ID. It represents project name or module name as artifact ID. And it will ask for version. You can give snapshot version or final version or release version. What is the meaning of snapshot? Snapshot represents your project is under development. Release or final represents project development is completed. And it will ask for package name. It will ask for package name. Base, it represents base package in the project. It represents base package in the project. Okay. What is the base project? From where it will start the component scanning. You can give base package name as anything. Sir, you are giving group ID name, package name as same, no problem. Suppose in dot Ashok ID dot, I'm developing a passport project. For that, I will give package name as in dot Ashok ID dot passport. Package name, what package name you want to use? The base package name you can give. All right. Can you see these settings? What we are using while creating the boot project? All of you, please read these settings that we are selecting while creating the boot project. Please read it. Guys, are you able to understand? Are you able to understand? Artifact ID. You can give your project name as artifact ID. My first app. Or you can give any project name. If you're developing a project for user management app. Okay. So if you're developing a project for ticket booking app, you can give any name for artifact ID. Artifact ID represents project name. Group ID represents company name. Version represents what is the state of your project. Is your project development completed or is your project is under development? If your project development is completed, we will say that as a snapshot. If the project development is completed, we will say that as a release, final project. Okay. Options to choose while creating the boot application. Options to choose while creating boot application. Options to choose while creating the boot application. Build tool supports both. Languages support 3. Group ID, you can give anything. It can be a project name or it can be a company name. Artifact ID, it can be a project name or it can be a module name. Version, by default, it will come as a snapshot. You can change the version to anything. So if you keep the version name as a snapshot, that means the project is under development. If you keep the version as release, that means development completed. You can keep release or final. Okay. Then after package name, it will ask, it represents base package name in the project. You can give anything as a base package name. You can give any name as a base package name. Guys, you got it? What is a Spring Boot and what are the advantages with the Spring Boot and what is the first version of the Spring Boot and what is the current version of the Spring Boot and how many ways we can create the boot application and what are the options it is going to ask to create the boot application. What is the difference between group ID and package name? There is no difference, man. Group ID will represent your company, which company developing the project. Package name means what package you want to use in the project. There is no difference. We can't compare them. Group ID and package name, both are different. Group ID represents your project name. Artifact ID represents your Group ID represents your company name. Artifact ID represents your project name. Package name means what package you want to create in the project by default to keep your classes. All right. Yeah. Now, guys, anyone having any questions? So please raise your hand and you can ask. In the tomorrow session, we are going to understand what is the folder structure of the Spring Boot, how the folders are organized in the Spring Boot, what files are created in the Spring Boot project, what is the purpose of them, how to run the boot project. That we will discuss in the tomorrow session. Today we understood what is Spring Boot, what are the advantages of the Spring Boot, how to create boot application, what options we need to select while creating the boot application. In the tomorrow session, we will discuss folder structure for the Spring Boot and how to execute Spring Boot application and how internally it is going to work. Anybody having question? Can you please raise your hand? In the Zoom. In the Zoom, there is an option to raise your hand, not your right hand or left hand. Nobody having questions, huh? Yeah, you can unmute your mic. You can ask me. Anybody?
Ashok sir, will there be more Gradle lectures, or that was the last one which you have done on Saturday?
Right. That was the Gradle workshop. If you go through that workshop, you will understand how to create the Gradle project and how to execute it.
Okay, sir. Actually, I have attended that. But what happens is in my company, the whole configuration of project is quite complex because there are so many certs files are required for the Gradle projects and many things are there. So I'm facing some issue in that.
Sure, sir. Slowly we will also use the Gradle. We will configure that. So that workshop was for beginners. So that was just introduction class on the Gradle, right?
Yes. Okay, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Sir, next Ola sir project we are using Spring Boot.
Yeah.
Okay,
sir, which build tool is mostly used in industry, sir?
Sir, I can say both are having the mainly people are because Maven was there from long back, right? So people are using Maven mostly. Nowadays, Gradle also becoming famous. If you know both, that is good.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Right.
Sir, good evening. From my side, I have one doubt.
Yeah.
We are telling in Spring Boot no XML configuration, correct?
Correct.
But as per my knowledge, we are using pom.xml, correct?
Sir,
in Maven
the
side.
pom.xml not related to Spring Boot, right? We are not pom.xml. It is a Maven configuration. We should not consider.
Yes. Yeah, that is my doubt. That is long back doubt. That's why I plan to ask.
We should not compare. We should not consider pom.xml because pom.xml is not related to Spring Boot. That is a Maven build tool. Now, if you go for Gradle, then that XML also will not be available. No? Everything is.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi,
yes,
sir.
Hi,
sir. Actually, you are in Eclipse. You are writing code, no, sir. Can you give that source code, sir? Like we are facing some issues while writing the code.
Sure, sir. I will share. I will create one Git repository. I will publish the code into Git repository. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Because we have not started any development, just basic examples only we are doing. My intention is you people should be able to develop it on your own. And we created a Telegram group for the communication as well. Any questions, any problems, you can discuss with your friends and solve it. Because if you take my code, then you will not get the chance to think. So I want you to think and try to do it on your own. If you're facing a problem, so already group is there for communication. Okay, but still I will share the code for your reference. No problem.
Okay, sir. Sure. Thanks.
Perfect. Guys, I have uploaded class notes also in the portal. Last class notes and today's class notes I have updated. Could you please check it and let me know? Spring.
Good evening, sir.
Very good evening.
सर आपके फुल स्टैक डेवलपमेंट के बैच चालू नहीं होने वाले क्या
अभी नहीं है सर, मैं बताता हूँ सर कब से चालू करना, मैं बोलता हूँ उसके लिए, ठीक है? या टुडेस नोट्स आल्सो अपलोडेड इन द पोर्टल।
मतलब मेरे दोस्त ही है।
हाँ ठीक है सर, मैं बताता हूँ। टुडे क्लास नोट्स इज आल्सो अपलोडेड गाइस, सो प्लीज practice how to create the boot project in the initializer website and how to create the project in the IDE also. Yes, madam.
Sir, after completion of this course, Ashok IT provide a certificate for that Spring Boot
Course-
and
Yeah, course completion certificate we will provide if you want.
okay.
Yeah, right.
Hi, sir.
Sir, is there any issue on Java 17 for auto configuration? Because when I used that component scan, it was giving some problem.
Sir, still to be frank, I have not tried with Java 17. So next week we will try that. I need to set up that and I need to check it first how it is working. So I don't have any idea on the 17 as of now. I need to sit one weekend. I need to do some research on that. Then I can teach in the class also.
But career perspective, 8 is fine, right? Most
8
of
is
the people are
sufficient.
using.
8 is sufficient. Yes. 8
Yeah.
and if you have time, upgrade to 11 also.
Okay, okay. And one more doubt, sir. Like Spring Boot 2 uses which Spring version?
Spring 5.x.
Okay, okay.
Spring Boot 3.x version will use Spring 6.x version. Spring Boot up to 2.5, up to Spring Boot 2.x will use Spring Boot 5.x.
Okay, and what is the use of WAR file? Because jar is sufficient because its Spring Boot is having its own embedded server, right?
Yes, I will come to that, sir. When it comes to web application, I will tell you what is the purpose of the WAR.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, sir.
Hello.
Starting core Java class.
Sir, please, sir, upload, sir, debugging, sir. Also video in YouTube. मतलब, sir, so नहीं कर रहा है
Already,
YouTube
there is one video on the debugging. I will share that in the group, sir. Debugging video already there, but was previous video it is there.
Yes,
I
sir.
will-
It
I will
is
give
3
that.
years before.
I will give that video link.
Okay, okay. Thank you, sir.
Fine, guys. So thank you. Good night. We'll see you in the tomorrow session. The expectation is everybody should be able to create the boot application and should be able to run that in the IDE. Tomorrow we will understand folder structure of the Spring Boot application and we will understand the internals of the Spring Boot application. Thank you. Please practice it before coming to tomorrow's session. Anybody who did not attend Gradle, please go through Gradle video. That is very important for our upcoming classes. We'll see you in the tomorrow's session. Thank you, guys. Good night.